As you've heard on Bridge City News, Ottawa gave its approval for the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion for the second time. But will it actually be built? I know about 30% of the pipe is at the site, but will shovels actually go into the ground? To talk more about this multi-billion-dollar project is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, is this cause for celebration or just more of the same from the Trudeau Liberals? Will we actually see construction begin?
Well, I would say it is cause for sort of cautious optimism. That was certainly the attitude down at the legislature yesterday. Premier Jason Kenney saying, "Oh, this is great news. This is a first step," but his focus was really on not so much getting shovels in the ground, but having oil flowing through the pipe. Now, there was a little bit of caginess yesterday from federal government officials on what exactly that was going to look like, getting shovels in the ground. That is, with 6 months left in the year, the expectation is that you will see construction begin probably sometime in September, seems to be what everyone is saying. Now, of course, we've heard that before. There have been innumerable delays caused by the courts, protesters, what have you. I would say there's no guarantees at this point when it's going to start, but certainly everyone is ready to go. There were reports over the last week or so of pipe being transported out to the site and things like that. So clearly people are ready for this to happen. And I think it is fair to say that once everyone's ready to go, construction is going to start. The question is just sort of what could halt it along the way.
Okay, what about the NDP and the Greens, and more specifically John Horgan in British Columbia? Is that little consortium there able to stop this project or obstruct it in any way?
Well, sort of, but not really. So the BC government had attempted to pass legislation a little while back that was going to allow it to restrict the flow of oil through the province. Now, that was going to be sort of a down the road thing. When this was done, they'd be able to say, oh, well, you can't actually ship your oil through it. The court said that can't happen. So basically where it exists now with this federal approval of the pipeline is that BC does still have some control over permitting aspects in terms of construction and things like that. So when John Horgan gave his press conference, that was sort of what he talked about, that they're going to take a close look at any permits that come up, safety, environmental regulations that they have control over, those sorts of things. So they could perhaps make it a little bit difficult here and there. Can the BC government put sort of a real hold on this? Not really. Now, of course, there could be court action. There could be Indigenous groups that decide to go to court, as they did last time, to try and say that once again, the review the government did was inadequate in terms of consultation with Indigenous people and looking at tanker traffic off the west coast of BC. You'll remember from last August, these were the reasons that this was sort of stopped for the last 10 months or so. So there are options. And of course, the other option is that there could be protesters on site who are not allowing vehicles through, not allowing workers onto the sites, things like that. We saw a little bit of that in months past. Now, how that is handled, of course, is almost a completely separate issue from the legal arguments and whatnot. So there are ways to hold this up. Is there a way to prevent it from being done? Legally speaking, not at this point, but time will tell on some of those questions.
You know, what's interesting, though, Tyler, is how we hear about Indigenous groups that are protesting, want to obstruct the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, but there are actually other Indigenous groups who are not only interested in investing the pipeline expansion, but even thinking of buying it, making an offer on it.
Yeah, that's right. And part of what the Prime Minister announced yesterday was this whole side of the pipeline of TMX to try and get Indigenous groups involved in it, whether that's sort of contracting along the way, whether that is actually finding an Indigenous group or consortium to buy it. Now, there have been reports over the last year or so of Indigenous groups that are springing up that are interested in buying this thing. So the federal government is sort of planning on doing some consultations, some outreach meetings, things like that to try and find Indigenous buyers for this thing. No timeline again on that. Who knows when that's going to happen? That's an awful lot of money for any group, any consortium to pull together to purchase this thing now that the government owns it. But until that happens, the revenues that are raised from the pipeline are going to be sort of recycled back into sort of green technology and transition to a no carbon future. So that's sort of what the future looks like in terms of the actual pipeline once it's done and oil's flowing.
Now, the oil will leave in tankers, but Bill C-48, otherwise known as the anti-tanker bill, will not apply to TMX oil. Why is that?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I hadn't thought that much about it and then was looking around after this and I asked myself that question. And so the explanation for it basically is that Bill C-48 restricts tanker traffic from the north of Vancouver Island up to Alaska, more or less. So that means that ports in, say, Prince Rupert are not allowed to offload, I should say, oil onto tankers that carry more than 12,500 tons. Now, the oil coming through the TMX pipeline is shipped out in Vancouver, at the port sort of in Burnaby there. So that means it does go through the Salish Sea, and that's where we had concerns about the southern resident killer whale population. You go through the Strait of Georgia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and on its way out to the Pacific. So there are sort of some navigation concerns. That's a busy, busy traffic area. There are some environmental concerns involving the whales and whatnot, but there are some different sort of contextual issues up north, mainly that there has been sort of a de facto moratorium on tanker traffic for a long, long time. So oddly enough, 350 kilometers apart as the crow flies, oil tanker traffic is okay. And, above that sort of northerly red line, it's not okay. So I spoke with former Premier Christy Clark, and she said, this is just a bizarre thing, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's an odd situation to say the least, but that's the explanation for why the oil can get out to sea without too much trouble.
So Tyler, bottom line, when will the oil be flowing?
An excellent question. Best guess scenario is probably about 2022. That seems to be the estimates that are floating around right now. Government officials certainly refuse to stick to a timeline on that sort of thing. Politicians were a bit wishy-washy about that. Understandably, no one wants to overpromise and underdeliver. So unfortunately, we'll have to wait and see, but best bet, a few years down the line.
So how important is the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion to the Alberta economy and even bigger picture, the Canadian economy?
It's the pipeline itself, it's hard to say exactly. The larger issue in all of this, of course, is the matter of how you're getting oil out of the country. The present problem being that most pipelines are running to the United States. That's where all the buyers are. You need to take trains to get the oil sort of out to the coast at the moment. There's all these sort of transportation issues right now that, as people will remember from last year, led to this massive, massive price differential. Canadian oil was selling at a significant discount because there simply wasn't enough pipeline capacity. Now, that number, the Alberta government said, was something approximating $80 million a day is what was being lost from lack of pipeline capacity. Now, there's some debate over that number. It could have been 40 million, could have been 100 million, but no matter how you look at it, the lack of pipeline capacity is costing the Alberta economy and sort of by extension, the Canadian economy, millions and millions of dollars a day. And TMX is part of increasing that capacity to get oil to markets, which closes that price differential that was costing so much money and starts bringing that money back into government coffers, the pockets of private citizens, all those sorts of things. So those are sort of the numbers that are bouncing around on that.
So Premier Jason Kenney was in New Brunswick recently talking about the importance of getting our oil to the East Coast so Maritimers don't have to purchase Saudi oil. Any chances of Energy East being revived somehow?
Well, the Premier seems to think so. I think it is a debatable point whether or not there is a business case to be made for this project at this point in time. But the last time that this was seriously discussed was when the political sort of geography of Canada looked very, very different. You have a good number of conservative premiers in power right now. You have reasonably business-friendly politicians in Quebec in power right now. And you have a premiers meeting coming up in just a few weeks here where Jason Kenney surely is going to make that a big issue. I think for the Alberta government, that's very much a desired thing. I do suspect the wild card on that is whether or not you're going to find private money that's willing to risk perhaps doing this thing and going through the hurdles that these big infrastructure projects need to in 2019.
Okay, we'll leave oil for just a moment here. Tyler, the Privacy Commissioner took an unusual step of speaking out on Tuesday, saying students who join gay-straight alliances are protected by privacy legislation. So Tyler, in short, the claims of the NDP that the new education legislation will allow schools to out kids are not entirely accurate.
Yeah, that's right. So the NDP has a reasonably fair point to make, I think, in saying that some of the changes over gay-straight alliances maybe weaken protections, maybe don't make it as good for kids in school in terms of principals having to speedily allow these alliances to be created and things like that. But yeah, the main objection that they've been raising is that it's going to allow principals in schools or what have you to out kids to their parents. Now, the UCP said all along that this protection was derived from the Privacy Act. And that's more or less the case. The right to have your activities in school be kept private when it's something so intimate. These are protections not laid out in education legislation, not under the NDP, not under the UCP. So that maybe took the wind out of the NDP's sails a little bit. And as people will know, this has been quite a contentious thing down at the legislature over the last couple months, and was on the campaign trail as well. So it was an unusual statement, but it did sort of back the UCP on that, saying, well, no, this is privacy legislation, and no education act can really tinker with those rights all that much.
More than 9,000 people have been forced from their homes in northern Alberta once again. Tyler, firefighters are praying for more rain and cooler temperatures to help battle the blazes. I mean, the Chuckegg Creek wildfire is now more than 270,000 hectares in size. It appears we're not out of the woods just yet.
No, it's a shame that the Edmonton weather isn't moving north at a faster pace, because it's been pouring rain this week down here. So yeah, that's right. There are evacuation alerts in place. There are evacuation notices in place. This thing is by no means nearly finished. And, to this point, still, thankfully, there have not been any major catastrophes. But as they say with wildfire season, it's nowhere near done yet.
Okay, let's chat about labor rights now. It's been a very hot button topic at the legislature. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the Coles Notes version of it is that the UCP has introduced legislation that is going to sort of push back the timeline on wage negotiations for a bunch of unionized public servants, nurses, and things like that. So what had happened was, some years ago, they had agreed to a wage freeze, and then they were going to be able to go into arbitration after that. There could be binding arbitration on the negotiation. So some of these groups of employees have entered into these wage negotiations. Now, the government has put in place legislation, or is working on legislation in the legislature, that would push back those previous guarantees of entering into wage negotiations. So understandably, unions are upset, because people had expected to be negotiating their salaries at this point in time. And the NDP is really upset about this. You had people shouting shame, shame in the legislature in debates on this. And it is sort of part of what Jason Kenney had been promising during the campaign in his opening days as premier, that there was going to have to be a little bit of belt tightening, and that the finances were in rough shape, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, very contentious, certainly affecting an awful lot of public servants around the province. People are not happy, and these sort of wage and labor disputes, it doesn't matter who's in government on these things. No one really ends up looking that great at the end of it. It's a nasty business. The federal level, provincial, it doesn't matter. It's a tough one.
Okay, let's go back to oil for just a moment here. During the campaign, there was a lot of talk of, by Rachel Notley, who was premier at the time of the NDP, supporting the oil pipelines. But I remember not that long ago when Rachel Notley was very anti-pipeline. Lethbridge West MLA here, Shanna Phillips, was very anti-pipeline. But of course, when they were trying to get the TMX expansion, it was like, let's go pro-pipeline. But now that they're no longer in government, has the sentiment changed with the NDP? Are some of the members now, the MLA members, against oil now? Or are they still very much pro-pipeline?
They seem to certainly be very much pro-pipeline still. I mean, it was this sort of weird phenomenon, wasn't it, where the sort of space for debate on pipeline politics in Alberta narrowed very, very quickly. And all of a sudden, anyone who wanted to be in government was not going to be able to hold an anti-pipeline view. I would say that their objection for the last several weeks, months even, to Jason Kenney's politics and that of the UCP is they just sort of don't think that he's going about it the right way. They think the sort of bombastic attitude, the threats of an equalization referendum, the traveling around the province, or the country, I should say, meeting with other conservative premiers and things like that. They just don't see that as very tactical politics. That, if you tick people off, well, they're not going to support this. You're not going to have the, what everyone called the social license for these things. So no, they are still pro-pipeline. I think they probably have to be in many ways. The dispute continues, I think, to be about tactics.
Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me once again from soggy Edmonton. Thanks a lot, Tyler.
Thanks, Al.